Welcome to the ClearAdmit MBA Admissions Academy. I'm Graham Richmond, and I'm with Alex Brown, and we're going to use this lesson to talk about MBA rankings and how you can use those rankings as you begin the school selection process and even throughout the whole admissions process. So Alex, what are the main rankings that people should be going to? Because I know there are literally dozens of rankings out there of business schools, but I know you and I both have a pretty strong opinion that there are kind of four that matter most. So you want to walk us through what's your favorite?
Yeah, and obviously, like you say, there are plenty of rankings out there. The US News ranking is probably the gold standard for the US-based programs.
Agreed.
I think we can both agree to that, although I would take issue with some of their rankings of their most recent ranking, but we might talk about that a little bit later. But they're generally pretty robust in the US. And then you've got the Financial Times probably does the best job more globally as a sort of global MBA ranking. So I'd put those two rankings at the top of the pile.
Yeah, and then we also, maybe some of its history, but we do talk a little bit about the Business Week. Yeah. Bloomberg Business Week ranking of business schools. They were the first, correct?
I mean, I used to love the Business Week rankings because when I worked at the Wharton School, they ranked Wharton number one.
Every year,
so
yes.
Well, it was every second year at the time.
It was every other year.
Yeah, so that was absolutely fantastic. So Business Week has a longer history with the rankings, and fair enough, John Byrne at Poets and Quants, I think, sort of innovated the rankings when he was at Business Week.
Correct.
So you got the Business Week rankings, and then there are several others.
Yeah, and the only other one that I would bring to light is the Forbes ranking. And this is actually a good opportunity to talk about how these rankings differ because they all have their own methodology. And I would argue that U.S. News, and one of the things I love about the U.S. News ranking is that it's quite based around selectivity, peer assessment, like what other academic institutions think of the given school in question, and somewhat about outcomes, career placement and things. So it's a very holistic ranking, and I think that makes it strong. The FT is a bit more focused on outcomes and alumni earnings. And so I think in particular, they spend a lot of time trying to figure out how much people make. I can't remember if it's 3 or 5 years out. So there's a heavy emphasis on that there. With Forbes, the one that I just mentioned, theirs is all about return on investment. So it's all about what does it cost you to go to that program, how much you're going to earn, and how long, in effect, how long will it take you to recoup what you've spent. So it's a very interesting ranking. It sometimes varies from the others just because of that focus on the money. Business Week is a bit more around, they survey the students and they survey employers, try to get sentiment. All these rankings have multiple levers that they push and pull. And I think between you and me and everyone, listening, we've got, I think, some manipulation that happens in order to keep the ranking fresh, right? I feel like there's almost a need for them to have a slightly different order each year to sell their magazines. But those are the main four rankings. Yeah. What about someone who comes to you and says, hey, wait, The Economist does a ranking and so does QS. What do you say to that?
Yeah, Wall Street Journal too.
Yeah, right? They used to do one, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, The Economist, what a fantastic brand. I'm a huge fan of The Economist. I am not a fan at all of their rankings. They're just rubbish.
Yeah.
So the reason why we bring this up, not to bash The Economist, but you do need to recognize which rankings you're looking at. As you say, look at the methodologies. And be cautious. And I would say all the rankings, their algorithms have some little glitches and little flaws to them. So looking at them all together, and that's another sort of ranking that we're familiar with, the aggregate sort of ranking that Poets and Quants does, which I think is quite a good way to approach it, where you see all the rankings together and come up with some sort of cumulative outcome.
Yeah, arguably, if a school is appearing in the top 5 or whatever it is across every ranking that you look at, you start to you can make the claim that this is clearly a school that maybe needs to be in my consideration set if you're someone that's aiming for top schools. And I think that's where aggregating the rankings makes a lot of sense because over the more rankings you've got in there, looking at and I would even argue year over year. that you could look at. For example, I think it's quite instructive to look at like the last 10 years worth of data from US News, so that you can kind of see which schools are moving up and down over time, that kind of thing. So, but aggregating the rankings, I think, can be quite useful.
Just don't include the economists in that aggregate ranking.
Right. Right. So, but what about, so here we are talking about rankings, and I think they can be useful as people look to assess, how hard it is to get into a school, because clearly the schools that are always coming up at the top are going to be harder to get into. So if you're looking for that reach school, that's a nice way to, but also you can use it to look for safeties too. But the other thing I was going to ask you is, talk about ordinal rankings, which is what these all are. They're numbered rankings, versus what we would call a tiered ranking, which is something that I know you and I believe in very strongly, but I want to hear you explain this. So what is the difference between ordinal and tiered?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I think this is something Clearadmit has innovated. In terms of, we don't look at rankings from sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and see a movement from 6 to 4, and isn't that very good? What we tend to see is certain programs belong in the same tier.
Yeah.
Right? So right at the top tier would be Harvard, Stanford. Just behind that is Wharton, and then behind that are the remainder of the M7. So that's your Kellogg and your Booth, Sloan, and
Columbia.
And Columbia, yes, thank you for that. and the point here is, we would make the argument that Columbia, Booth, Kellogg and Sloan, so if they're all in the same tier, they could be equally as strong. And it depends on the individual. If you're seeking sort of healthcare in Boston, then maybe Sloan is a good option versus Columbia. If you're seeking finance on Wall Street, maybe Columbia is a better choice over Sloan, or whatever it might be, right?
Sure.
So the point is, these programs belong in tiers. So behind that tier, there'll be another tier that'll maybe actually include 5 or 6 programs. You've got your Dukes and your Dardens and your Yales and Haas and so on and so forth. So to me, tiers is a much better way to look at this.
Right, and I know people get very worked up. You see across the discussion forums on the web, people will argue about, this school is 7 this year. Last year they were 8. And so and I agree with you. I could not agree more that it's better to think of them in just groupings.
Yeah.
And I think you make the great point that depending on your career plan, your geographic preferences, and even fit, as we discussed in the first lesson in the academy, fit can come into the school selection process too. And so depending on all those factors, you may prefer Chicago Booth over Kellogg.
Right.
But arguing that one is actually better than the other
for everyone,
just universally is totally ridiculous, right? So,
but we would argue that, for example, Harvard is better than those in that tier because they're in a higher tier. So that's where the tiering system comes in.
Yeah, very helpful. And we'll get into this as we discuss in some of the other lessons in the academy. But I do think that we see behavior with respect to scholarships, the tiers really start to come out when you see how much money someone's given to go to a school, things like that. So rankings can be really useful, I think, as a way to begin to look at it. But use them in aggregate if possible. Look at multiple years and keep in mind that it doesn't have to be ordinal. It can be tiered. That's the way we like to think of it. This is, I think, a great primer on how to use the rankings. Anything else, Alex, on this?
No, I think that's pretty much sums it up.
All right. So next up, we're going to talk about personal inventory and how you go about kind of mining your past to prepare for the application process.